In my last video, I built these workbench legs from plain angle iron, trying to give them a vintage cast iron look. Now I need to finish the workbench, adding all of the wood, putting it all together and making it not only functional, but hopefully something that will inspire me every time I use it. I'll get straight into it. Here's the main pieces I'll use for the bench top. 2 lengths of Oregon. I don't have enough though for the whole top, so I'll fill in between with pine studs. The pine studs will also be used for a shelf, and they're fairly substantial beams, so I'll start by preparing the pine first. I bought them from a local salvage yard. I paid $3 a metre, and I much prefer to use these than fresh pine from the hardware store. They're well seasoned, straight, and not full of sap. They're already denailed, but I like to check myself before putting them through the thicknesser and ruining the blades. Good job I did, as I found 4 more, and I really should get myself a metal detector. There's obviously nail holes already in, that doesn't worry me, and for the bench top the studs will sit upright, exposing the edges which don't have any nail holes anyway. I've planed both faces on all of them. The ones on the stairs are for the top, the next one's for the shelf, then the beam and a few more spares which I will need for a few extra pieces. The shelf and the beam are shorter than the top, so I'll cut those down to rough length. I've done one and I'm using that to mark out the rest and picking out the best section of each stud. I'm not cutting anything to exact length, I'm leaving extra on for now and will trim each part after it's been glued together. I'm also jointing one edge on the shelf and beam pieces. The beam pieces only need doing on one edge, and the shelf pieces I'll do the opposite edge later on the table saw. I'll put the shelf and benchtop pieces aside for now and get on with the beam. 3 pieces together aren't quite enough, so I'll cut an extra piece for each set of 3. Now I'll glue those together. They make up 2 halves of the beam, which I'll plane after this glue up when they're dry, and then glue those together afterwards. I left them for an hour, so let's get them out to the clamps and then plane them. I've cut 2 more strips off camera, which will get glued between the 2 halves, and that will leave a rebate either side for 2 lengths of threaded rod to sit in. I'll nail them into the one side to keep them in the correct position and stop them moving around. As I mentioned in the last video, it'd be much easier to join the legs together by welding angle iron between, but I really like this method and I've always wanted to try it. I left it overnight to set up, so I'll get the clamps off and trim it to length. Because the blade doesn't reach quite halfway, I set up a magnet as a stop in line with the blade so I could make one cut, line that up with the stop and make the next. I didn't give it too much thought and it worked okay on this end where I could break off the waste, but then I realised I couldn't do that on the other end, so I just marked it and cut it to the lines. I could have and probably should have done this with a miter saw, which also has a deeper blade. That's the beam done. I'll ease the edges, sand it and apply some oil, and then I can assemble it with the legs. Before I join the legs with the beam, I'll fit the casters, as that will be easier to do now. The casters are heavy duty even though they're low profile, and I searched them out for those reasons. When you install 4 casters, you take the weight that 3 of them can carry, and that's their combined maximum load. These ones are rated for 300 kilograms, so that's 900 in total, which is way more than I'll ever need. But when you buy casters, it's worth getting ones that are more than suited for the purpose. The brake levers aren't the biggest, so they may be a bit fiddly, but they had to be small with the position I've used them in, as they need to spin a full 360 degrees without hitting the leg. I think I can assemble this on my own. I'll give it a go, and if I struggle, I'll get some help then. It's a very tight fit, but I suppose that's a good thing, so I'll hammer it home. This is when I could probably do with some help. The nut on the one end needs holding while I tighten the other end. I'll try the vice grips and see if they'll rest against the other nut and stop it from spinning. It worked, and once there's tension on there, they don't spin at all, and I can easily go around and tighten the rest. I was expecting it to be fairly sturdy with just the beam connecting the legs, but I wasn't expecting it to be quite this rigid. It really is very solid, and I reckon it's starting to look awesome. I'll put it next door for now while I work on the next piece. The shelf is pretty straightforward, so I'll do that next, and then I can get on with the top, which is far more interesting. If you remember, I still had one more edge to finish, so I'll do that now by quickly running these pieces through the table saw. The shelf will have nail holes showing. I could fill them, but I'm not going to worry. They just add a bit of character. I reckon the workbench will look at its best in a few years when it's got scratches and scars all over it. I left it to set while I had lunch, which was about an hour and a half. It's too big to go through the thicknesser, so after scraping the excess glue off, I'll finish it with the drum sander. It honestly doesn't need to be that good. It's only a low down shelf on a workbench. I could have just cleaned it up with a hand plane or an orbital sander. The open-ended drum sander and a coarse belt though does clean it up nicely. That is a pretty coarse finish. I did use a 36 grit belt, but because it sanded so well, I've decided to put a 120 grit belt on and run it through again. I'm putting a good coat of oil on, which I'll leave overnight, and while I've got the oil out, I'll put another coat on the beam. It's the next morning and the shelf's dry, so I'll fit it to the workbench. Even though the workbench is already sturdy, the shelf will make it even more rigid, and the top will make it even more rigid again. I've tucked it out of the way the best I can, as now the shelf's fitted, it doesn't fit through the doorway. Now I can get on with the top, and to fit the studs together, I'm going to use threaded rods. To drill the holes for them, I'll use this drill guide, and to make it even easier, I made a couple of these pegs on my lathe, which when installed on the guide will act as a centre finder. I just need to mark the hole positions. I'll start with one in the centre, and there'll be 5 in total. To try and keep the holes evenly spaced, I've cut a piece of scrap to length, which I'll use to mark it out. Dividers would be the go, but I don't have any big enough. When I come to glue the top up, I don't want to be fighting too much with lining up the holes, so it's worth getting them pretty accurate now. The threaded rod is M12, and I'll drill the hole slightly larger at 13mm to give me a bit of clearance. The brad point locates nicely into the knife mark, so it should all line up fairly well. The guide along with the centre finder pegs worked well. It went very smoothly. Next I'll cut the Oregon beams to rough length and then drill those ready for the threaded rod. It's not the cleanest cut, as the weight of the beam made it awkward to push smoothly through the saw, so I'll clean it up with a hand plane. That's a pretty straight edge. They fit together nicely, so I'll mark and drill for the threaded rods. I'm not sure how well this will go, but I'll go through one side, then transfer the marks onto the other edge, and then hopefully the holes will match up. On the outside edge, I need a recess for a nut and washer. I'll do that first with the force and a bit, and then I'll drill through afterwards. I'm not quite reaching through to meet up with the opposite hole, so I'll finish them all with the guide first, and then I'll put the bit directly into the drill, and that should expose a bit more of the drill bit. I'm having to do that from both sides, and there's barely any drill bit being held in the chuck. That's just about done it, and it saved me going out and buying a 13mm long drill bit, and it lined up pretty well too. Before I glue them up, I just need to make one of the recesses for the nut and washer a bit deeper. That's because it will interfere with the pattern maker's vise that I showed in my last video. I'll be installing it on this corner by chopping the back jaw of the vise into the bench top, so the hardware needs sinking in further and out of the way. I've wrapped a couple of scraps with packing tape to put underneath and lift the pieces off the bench while I glue them together. I'll install a threaded rod through the centre and the two ends before I start gluing, and then the last two I'll install later. I'm not sure how effective the threaded rods will be, but I think they should keep the top under compression and limit any expansion across the grain. I've seen quite a few old workbenches made this way, and I thought it suited what I'm building here. They're not really needed, but they don't hurt either. I have made a couple of things over the years using this method, so it's not the first time that I've done it. One benefit is you don't need any long clamps, so it's a consideration if you're in that position. They need a bit of help here and there to get the rods through, but not difficult at all. It'll be the twist and bends in the studs, even though they're not that bad, slightly throwing off the holes. Anyway, I'll push them over to the one side, ready for the glue up, but first I'll put the nuts and washers on the one end of the rods. It's actually a pretty easy glue up, and if you've ever done any kind of big glue up like this before, you'll know that sometimes it can get quite stressful. I'm just getting them so tight for now. I'll install the last two rods and then I'll really tighten all of them. The first one installed easily, but the second one was a bit more stubborn. Hammering it was working, but it's quicker and easier to just screw it in. Next I'll start to flatten it, and I've decided to do it with hand planes. I'm just checking the whole thing for twist, just to give me an idea of what I'm dealing with, and it's not too bad. I'll flip it over and flatten the underneath first. I won't go crazy with that side, but I'll just get it something like. Some of you may remember this plane that I made a few years ago. I've swapped the blade out with an old one and ground a radius on it to use as a scrub plane. It's taken off the material quickly. I'm really enjoying it, and that's why I decided to plane it by hand rather than using a router. It's hard work though, but I could do with the exercise. I do already have a large flattening bit for the router, which would be perfect, and it'd only take half an hour or so to knock up a sled and a couple of rails, but I really do love using hand planes. Once I've removed the bulk of the material, which is basically the centre section made up of the studs, I'm taking off all the high spots with the number 7 Stanley. It's quite a wide table, just over a metre, so it's a bit of a stretch over to the other side. That's nowhere near perfect, but it doesn't need to be. I'll remove the paint and oil it, I'll leave it overnight and then turn it over and start working on the other side. I got some help to flip it over. As you probably saw the last time that I did it, I didn't have a good hold of it and I let it go. I'll install the top next onto the base. This will make it easier to plane, as it will be a touch lower than it is at the moment on top of the old bench. I've decided to make the mounting holes on the one side of each leg into a slot, and that's to allow for any wood movement in the top. I did consider this while building the legs, and I was banking on the threaded rod doing its job and stopping any expansion. Also, as I've seen with other old workbenches, the top is what hold the legs together, some of them just the top and nothing else. If that were the case, the top would be part of the structure, so would need bolting down super tight, which wouldn't help with wood movement. That's where the threaded rods through the top come in to limit the expansion. Anyway, the way it's worked out, I don't need to do it like that. The bench with the beams and the shelf is already super sturdy, so I'm not relying on the top as part of the structure itself. And now with the slots, I can leave those fixings slightly backed off. I'll line it up, then fix it down. I just need to leave enough this end for the pattern maker's vise. I'm just checking over this side and where it's at before I start planing. The two outside beams are just about perfectly straight, so that gives me a good starting point. First I need to get the centre section down, just like on the underside. That's just about flat, so now I'll start to smooth it out. I made plenty of passes, checking and working out where more needs taking off and slowly working towards a flat bench top. I've got it pretty flat at this point, but I am struggling to get a good finish with the tear out, especially around the knots. I'll flood those areas with low odour CA glue and see if that makes an improvement. While I've been waiting for that to dry, I've made a decision. I'm putting the planes away and I'm going to finish it with the orbital sander. I'm not sure how well this will work, as I may lose some of the flatness that I've been working hard to get, but those knots really are very hard and they're not much fun to plane at all. I'm using a 40 grit disc, which really does remove material fast, so I'll keep checking my progress and make sure that I'm not doing anything drastic to it. I'm starting to get there, and I reckon now would be a good time to try and make a bit of room. I'm taking a couple of tools out, which I'll store out the back as I hardly ever use them, and then put the old bench at the back. It'll still need a bit of organising, but it'll work for now. I'm starting to get somewhere on the top. I'll check things over again before I finish it, and I've noticed that there's a slight twist. It's not too bad, but it does need dealing with. I just need to take two of the corners down a touch. I've mixed up some wood glue and sawdust to fill in a few voids, mainly around the knots. That's looking really good, and I reckon it's definitely good enough, even though there is the odd bit that's just a hair lower. So just to finish it off, as I've already gone this far, I've glued 40 grit sandpaper to this piece of box section, which will finish it off, leaving it just about perfect. I went over it about a dozen times, leaving a super flat surface. In hindsight, especially with the amount of knots and how difficult they were to deal with, I would probably have done it with the router. It wouldn't have been any better, but it would have been much easier and faster. That looks great, and I'll just do a final check for twist. And that looks great too. I'll give it a quick sand just to remove some of the 40 grit scratches. I'm using an 80 grit disc, and I don't actually want the top to be too smooth. I want it to have a bit of grip, so I'm only going over it a couple of times. Now to trim the ends. My cordless saw doesn't quite cut deep enough, so I found this old one out that I haven't used for years. The blade's a bit rusty, but it should work fine. A track saw would be nice, but I don't have one, so a piece of plywood for a guide will do the job. I just have to measure back to allow for the saw's base, and in my case, the edge of the base is 105mm away from the blade. It's a horrible stance to be planing such a big section of end grain. It's difficult to get in a good position, but with a sharp blade I managed. I could have sanded the ends, but this will look a lot sharper. I've decided that I like the look of the old painted sides. I think they suit the style of the workbench, and I can always sand them off later on if I change my mind. I asked on Patreon and it was about 50-50 whether to leave it or not. What would you do? I'll be building the coats up over the next month or so, which will also help with reducing wood movement. The pine and Oregon blend together fairly well. You can definitely see it, but it's not too much of a contrast. I still need to install the Pask Makes vise, which I plan on restoring and fitting to the bench in my next video. I also need to install my other homemade quick release vise as well. It's a bit different to most workbenches, but I love it, and as I've mentioned, I reckon it's a piece that will inspire me while working on future projects. Let me know what you think of it and if you'd be happy with it in your workshop. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.